Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part three as we look at the Gospel of John. And the portion we left off here was with the Bread of Life discourse, where I mentioned how the Gospel of John, it doesn't feature a Last Supper setting, but it does contain what is known as the Bread of Life discourse, which is about the Eucharist or the Holy Communion. So what I thought I would do here is mention how Christians understand the Eucharist or Holy Communion, the various understandings that they have. One is the notion of the real presence, that Jesus is somehow truly present in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. There are two traditional understandings regarding the real presence. One is the view of transubstantiation, which is the understanding that when the words of consecration take or mention, said by the celebrant, "This is my body, this is my blood," that the bread and wine the substance of the bread and wine remain, but Jesus becomes truly present body and blood, soul and divinity under the looks and taste of bread and wine. The other understanding regarding the real presence is consubstantiation. Consubstantiation is the view that when the words of consecration, in this case, "This is my body and this is my blood," is said by the celebrant, Jesus becomes present with the bread and wine, that the substance of bread and wine remain, but Jesus is present with it. Word co here, co or with. So, in terms of the real presence, those that hold to this particular view, you have Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Anglican slash Episcopalian, Church of England, and then Methodists. Of course, the Catholic view, the official understanding they have is transubstantiation. The Orthodox Church agrees with that as well. They often don't use that term, although some Orthodox theologians in the West will. They prefer the term great mystery, but they hold to the theology. Where it was challenged a little bit was with Luther. Luther, when he had his official break with Catholicism in his Babylonian captivity of the church, he mentions how for the first 1200 years of the church's history, all one had to do was hold to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, but there was not an official understanding of how Jesus was present. That didn't take place until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, where transubstantiation became the official understanding of how Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist. And in case you're wondering how it was that the council fathers, and more specifically the bishops, had this out for discussion, is because there were questions of, does the Eucharist turn to dung like any article of food? Jesus states in the Bread of Life discourse, "My flesh is true food, my blood is true drink." Does it turn to dung like anything else? And I'll just say the answer to that question was no. I won't get into how it was no, but the answer was no. But anyway, Luther stated that if you wanted to hold that view, transubstantiation, that was fine, that was acceptable. But if you wanted to have a different understanding of how Christ was present in the Eucharist, such as consubstantiation, then that was okay too. It's just fundamental that you believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. And I would say that the Church of England, Anglican, referring to England here, English, um, commonmost form of the Church of England in this country is the Episcopal Church, Episcopalian. I would say that for most of their history, they've probably held to Luther's view, I would say overall. And the Methodist Church, I would say probably maybe a little bit more consubstantiation with them, but I would say they probably would not have problems today with somebody holding to transubstantiation. So I would say that, overall, they probably would hold a little bit to Luther's view on this subject. Then next you have symbolic, and how the bread and wine are symbols of Jesus's body and blood and nothing more. And for symbolic, we have Zwingli, Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli, who was a Swiss Protestant reformer, in his work, The Commentary on True and False Religion, he makes a notion about how, Jesus says that he's the vine. Well, he's not literally a vine. And how Jesus says that he's the light. Well, he's not literally light. And Jesus says that he's the gate. Well, he's not literally a gate. So when Jesus says, I am the bread and the bread of life, that it's just a symbol and nothing more. It's just a symbol of his body and his blood, but no real presence. And then next here we have individual relativity. And this point of view essentially holds that if one holds Christ to be present in the Eucharist, then he is present. But if one holds the Eucharist to be a symbol, then it's just a symbol. And for individual relativity, we have Calvin, John Calvin. John Calvin, the French Protestant reformer, he was trying to find a moderate view, on the Eucharist, trying to find a moderate view between the positions of Luther and Zwingli. And this comes from his work, The Short Treatise on the Lord's Supper. And he's not as explicit as Luther or Zwingli, but this is generally how historians understand him, a form of individual relativity where, if you hold Christ to be present in the Eucharist, then he's there, then he's present, he's truly present. But if someone next to that individual holds that the Eucharist is just a symbol, then it's just a symbol. So it was Calvin trying to find a moderate view between Luther and Zwingli. But I can't say completely that his view would work overall because, if you are somebody that holds the Eucharist as just a symbol, but from the Catholic perspective, the Orthodox perspective, the Lutheran perspective, the Anglican perspective, the Methodist perspective, you can say it's just a symbol all you want, but when the words of consecration are said, Christ is really present, regardless of what you may think. Whereas, if you do hold to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, from Zwingli's point of view, you can hold to it all you want, but the bread and wine are just symbols of body and blood and nothing more. So look a little bit more further here. We have the story of the woman caught in adultery and a little bit of anti-Judaism. So the story of the woman caught in adultery. You who are without sin, cast the first stone. This comes from the Gospel of John, where essentially a woman was caught in adultery, and the Jewish leaders inform Jesus. They say, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery. Moses, referring to the law of Moses, states that we are to stone her. What do you think?" Well, Jesus draws a line in the sand between the woman and the crowd, and he essentially states, "Okay, those of you who are without sin, you go and cast the first stone." And of course, everybody walks away. And then Jesus turns to the woman and says, "Is no one here to condemn you?" And she says, "No, sir." And Jesus responds back, "Well, neither do I condemn you. Go in peace, but sin no more." And pretty much any movie or play that features the life of Christ would have that story in that play or in that movie. But the story, it's not found in our earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. So, what would have been the copyist's or author's intent behind it? So, like I said, of our earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John, that story is not found. So, it's a later edition. But what would have been the author, the copyist's intent behind it? We can only speculate. But in looking at the Torah and looking in Deuteronomy, where, the best example I can see of where this story would have derived from, it goes back to where, if somebody, marries a woman and this person that marries her states that she wasn't a virgin when I married her, that her parents need to provide evidence that their daughter was a virgin when she married this man. And if they do, that husband is to be fined 100 shekels of silver, and that's going to be given to the woman's father because he slandered this woman and he won't be allowed to divorce her. Now, let me read here the portion in Deuteronomy that goes from the other perspective. If, however, this charge is true, that evidence of the young woman's virginity was not found, then they shall bring the young woman out to the entrance of her father's house, and the men of her town shall stone her to death, because she committed a disgraceful act in Israel by prostituting herself in her father's house. You shall purge the evil from your midst. Okay, so that's essentially what would be the case here with this particular example in John. So, what would have been the copyist, the author's intent behind the story of the woman caught in adultery? Again, we can only speculate, but I think it's the notion that everybody makes mistakes and people shouldn't be condemned for them. To give a more contemporary example, there is a subreddit, Catholicism, which I frequent some, and I happened to see a post. It was from maybe a week ago, and it was from a young woman who was 23 years old, and her boyfriend, they've been dating, I think she said, for 4 months, and they were, trying to, save themselves for marriage. She, I said, was 24. The boyfriend was 30, but temptation got them, and they had sex, and she lost her virginity in this process, and she wasn't sure what to do. Well, of course, no one on the subreddit condemned her. They just told her, go and receive the sacrament of reconciliation. But, and I'll actually mention something with that particular sacrament later in this lecture on John, because that sacrament's found in the Gospel of John. But, if anything, it's just a notion people make mistakes. Um, Perhaps a little bit here, of the mind body problem in the case with that couple, and shouldn't condemn them for a mistake when perhaps the mind or the body took control of one or the other. Well, I think we will stop here, but when we continue on, we will look more at the Gospel of John. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.